classroom. So we'll have all that. In the meantime, Amanda, I think if you're ready to go, people will filter in, I'm sure, and I will monitor the chat. Tim is going to show you Amanda's book, which everybody we recommend should purchase so that you can learn all about wines of South America. You can, I'm sure we sent you a couple of different links to get it, both through Amanda's site. There's an ebook, there's a 15% discount code that Amanda's offering everybody here. Also through the Académie du Vin, we've got a discount for them as well if you'd like the hardcover. We have it in our library at the school. You could look at it there, but we recommend you get your own. The other thing I'm going to say is that Amanda's going to be joining us in person at the school November 2nd. She's going to be with a bunch of fantastic winemakers from Uruguay who will be showcasing their wines. There are going to be 14 different wines that we're going to sample, and it's a heavily discounted class for those of you who are interested. So please do join up. It's on our website. In the meantime, Amanda, I'm going to throw it to you so that you can get going. I'm going to mute myself. Tim and I here are going to check out the chat. If anybody has questions, we'll sometimes interrupt Amanda where it's appropriate and ask her. And in the meantime, welcome everyone. It's lovely to see you.
Fabulous, thank you. Can everyone see my screen? Has that come across okay? Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for having me here, and thank you, Tim, for doing such a great presentation of the of the book. I've been based in South America since 2009. As you might guess from my accent, I'm actually British and English, but moved here to really learn about the wine regions from the ground up and kind of focus my career as a wine writer, which is what I do principally. I've gone through all of the kind of WSET levels, and at the moment I'm in the second year of the Master of Wine program, and so have quite a kind of broad understanding of the world of wine, but my specialism is very much in the regions of South America. And we're going to take a tour of South America over our time together. And I'm going to try and give you some kind of background on some of the wine regions and some of the exciting things that are happening in the different areas. So as I'm sure most of you will know, Vitis vinifera was not native to the Americas at all. So the first kind of Vitis vinifera vines that came, the ones that were used for wine production, came with the second voyage of Christopher Columbus. And that was in 1493. So along with the, many things that they brought great cultivars. They brought, in order to plant olive trees as well, and then also to plant wheat. And those first vines that came principally was Listan Prieto, which we know as the mission grape in the US, and País or Criolla Chica here in South America, and also Moscatel de Alejandría. And those two vines were kind of planted all over South America, made their different entrances at different areas, principally coming down from the Caribbean, actually. Venezuela was one of the first countries to be planted, not very successfully because it is quite a challenging climate there. But the grapes made their ways down to Peru, Chile along the coast, and then over the Andes into Bolivia and Argentina. They also entered Argentina via the coast of Buenos Aires as well. So we're going to talk about that as we get to each country. But I always think it's interesting to kind of start looking back at history, because it's kind of unfair to call this the New World in many ways when there's 500 years of winemaking history. But these two varieties, what was so interesting about them is that they gave birth to this huge native family tree, if you like, of Criollo varieties. This is an image from the book, and it's the first kind of chapter I wrote because I think it's so important and integral to the history and identity of South American wine, because up until the 1850s, these were the only varieties that were in production. And we have lots of unique varieties that only grow here in South America. One of the ones that you're probably most familiar with is Torrontés. But Torrontés is actually three grape varieties, three different varieties, but they're all native to Argentina. But then there's lots of very interesting ones like Bischoqueña in Bolivia, Mollar, which is typically used in Peru for pisco production. So really the first couple hundreds of years of history of South American wine is focused on these native Criolla grape varieties. And we've still got lots of those incredible old vines still in existence and still in production in different wine regions of South America. I'm a big geek and fan of old vines. I will mention them a few times in this presentation, but we have some really interesting kind of old vine hotspots where you can find these vines. I've seen vines that are over 200 years old and still producing wine. And obviously when you get to a certain age, these vines produce much more concentrated grapes, lower yield, and that's where we get some really exciting expressions of what were considered kind of lesser quality grape varieties, but actually when they've got some vine age, they make very interesting wines indeed. So these old vines, you know, notably in Bolivia, Peru, all over Argentina and all over Chile, but very much kind of focused in the south as well. And then it was in the 1850s that we started to see the European immigrants coming in, a new wave of European immigrants, but also immigrant vines, if you like. So that's where we started to get this big kind of rush of Bordeaux varieties, as well as lots of different Spanish, Italian, French, Swiss varieties all at the same time. And it was really kind of fortuitous because obviously at the end of the 1800s, that's when phylloxera started to spread through Europe and decimated many of the vineyards of Europe. And South America, Chile and Argentina notably, really became this kind of treasure trove of old vines and quite unique varieties. And in Chile in particular, where we've never had phylloxera, we still have lots of these vines that survive from the 1800s and from when they were first kind of brought from Europe, as well as our lovely Criolla vines. And I always think it's really interesting to kind of pull in this comparison because South America is a bit rubbish at doing its own marketing, I think, in terms of talking about the age of vines that they have. Australia does an incredible job at communicating their old vines. But if you look at this comparative, this is in hectares. I apologize because I speak in hectares and kilometers and meters. So I apologize in advance. So this is probably double in acres, close to double. But actually, you know, Chile has this incredible quantity of very old vines, over 70 years. Argentina also, and Australia, much less so, South Africa as well, even though they do have these incredible old vines. But it is really interesting, I think, to put that into context and kind of learn about the great diversity that exists here. So we're going to start our tour, and I do encourage if anyone has any questions or comments, because we're going to move through each country. And so, you know, if you have a question about Peru, then please do ask it kind of while we're in Peru. Otherwise, we can save it until the end. But we're going to start in Peru, which really was the kind of first wine country of South America. And I don't think that was necessarily due to advantageous climate. It was more an easier climate to plant than Venezuela or the Caribbean, for example. But it was really a political reason. And that's because the viceroyalty, the Spanish viceroyalty, set up in Peru, and they really needed wine to survive, as all of the missionaries did. And so they, you know, they started this wine industry in the 1540s and started making wines for their masses, for their services, but also to drink. And it really kind of exploded at the time. Peru became the biggest kind of first wine producing country of South America. And then in the 1600s, the Spanish crown started getting quite jealous of the wine production that was happening in Peru and actually banned production several times because they didn't manage at first to really control it, but they banned wine production. And that's why Peru started making pisco. So pisco being a brandy distillate from the grape varieties, from those original Criolla grape varieties. And they were allowed to continue making pisco until the prohibition was lifted quite some time later. Peru's never really recovered from that and has very much been focused more on pisco production rather than wine as the other countries kind of took over, especially Chile and Argentina, but notably for Peru, it was Chile that took over and started exporting their wines to Peru. So we have quite a small wine industry in Peru today. Most of those hectares there are actually dedicated to pisco production. However, there's a very interesting culture of wine in Peru today, and often focused on these old pisco varieties, these criollo varieties, and making a real host of quite interesting kind of local artisanal wines, often quite kind of focused on the more natural wine production, so kind of lower intervention. These little amphora that you see here are botijas, and they are the typical, they used to be used, they were what Chile would export their wine to Peru in, and they were used as winemaking vessels in Peru. So much like the way that we used barrels to store wine, and these were used for wine storage and then also got reused for winemaking. And there are some winemakers today who are actually crafting new botijas to make their own wines aged in botija. So that's a really interesting scene that's happening in Peru at the moment. It is quite wild going to the wine regions of Peru because most of them are along the coast and very much surrounded by sand dunes. You know, you really are making wines in the coastal desert. So this is one vineyard that I visited. It's actually in Lima, the region of Lima, not anywhere near the city. But it is quite incredible to be there. And the reason we can grow grapes there is because the coast of Peru has a very humid climate that comes from the Pacific Ocean, all that kind of lovely maritime fog, and gives you a nice kind of humidity, which is apt for grape growing with lovely sunny afternoons, which is, you know, good for the health of the grapes as well. We also have lots of kind of Tannat, Syrah, Malbec, lots of red grape varieties, Sauvignon Blanc, and Chenin, different white grape varieties grown in Peru for those kind of more international wines, and some very kind of long-standing wineries that have been producing wine in a clandestine way when it was prohibited, and then kind of restarting officially when that prohibition was lifted. We've got some interesting developments happening in Peru into the mountains, so up towards kind of Cusco. And that's going to be a really interesting new frontier for Peru, is this kind of high altitude winemaking. Cusco, which is where the Incan Empire was based, that's where the first vines, sorry, I lost my track. That's where the first vines were planted originally in the 1500s, but they didn't succeed very well at the time because it is not easy to make wine up there. Even though you have the benefits of altitude, you also have quite kind of humid forest and difficult kind of climate. So it's only recently that we're kind of re-seeing that mountain viticulture start again. But there's some beautiful wines. There's a project there called Apu, which if you're in Peru, I really recommend you try. Some really interesting, delicious Sauvignon Blanc and Nebbiolo from the hills. Okay.
Amanda, I have a question. This is Jessica about Peru. So we don't see almost any Peruvian wine here in the United States. So what is their export market like, even around South America or to the rest of the world? Are they exporting their wine? Is it really just for local consumption?
It really is for local consumption. I know there are certainly some producers that are interested in exporting, and there are some that do export. I know in the UK, for example, we get Intipalca, which is one winery. Another big winery to look for, the name is Takama, who also export. But it is they have a relatively small production, and it is sated and consumed by the local market. The best place to try Peruvian wine is in Peru, and very much in Lima. There are some, I'm sure everyone's kind of aware of the great boom of Peruvian gastronomy and the incredible chefs and food culture that they have. And Lima has some really beautiful, amazing restaurants, very much focused on their native cuisine and really celebrating their own wine production as well. So that's where most of it goes, is to the capital city of Lima. Sadly, there isn't much that makes its way to the US. But worth kind of keeping your eye out if you ever do see anything, and buy all the bottles because it will be surely a very kind of small amount that gets there, and share them with your friends. But I do recommend, if you come to South America, passing by Lima, going to some of these fabulous restaurants and exploring the wines. Especially notable is the restaurant Central. They have a great wine program as well.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Okay, I guess we have to organize a trip now to Peru. We'll work on that. And for those of you who have just come in, Amanda Barnes, who is the author of the South America Wine Guide, is telling us, she just finished speaking about Peru. She's telling us about lots of the wines that are grown and how they're grown in South America. And if you have any questions at all, just type them in the chat and we'll make sure that they get through. Okay, thanks, Amanda.
All right, let's cross over the mountains and we're going to go to Bolivia. Bolivia is, for me, one of the most extreme wine countries that I've ever visited, and that you could possibly imagine. Bolivia has a lot of disadvantages, really, because it is the only landlocked, completely landlocked country in South America. So it has no access to the sea. They do have a navy. The navy is based on Lake Titicaca, which is an enormous high altitude lake. It looks like a sea, you cannot see the end of it. It feels like a sea. They have islands on which people live. It is big enough to be a sea, but it does mean that Bolivia's never had that access really to the international market without going through other countries, which is a big disadvantage in terms of economic development and commercial development. So preempting the question, you're very unlikely to get Bolivian wine, unfortunately, exported to the US as well. But some is starting to make through. But Bolivia is one of the most incredible places for wine production because it is all high altitude. So it all starts at about 1,600 meters. And I apologize that I can't do the calculation of feet, but it's far higher than any wine region that you have in Europe or most of the rest of the world, in fact, and ranges up to well over 2,000 meters. So very high altitude winemaking, very remote regions, very difficult to make wine there because you're constantly trying to kind of get your winemaking equipment, your barrels, your tanks, come through from Argentina and their steep, difficult mountain roads for the majority. So it is isolated, but I do think it is a real kind of diamond in the rough and one that is really exciting to taste from and visit. And its history goes back quite far because what happened in Bolivia was the discovery of the great Potosí mine. Back I can't remember, it was just called the Potosí mine. And what happened with this discovery is that you had loads of Europeans come and settle in order to kind of get rich quick, which they did. It's an enormous mine that was hugely successful for over 100 years and still is functioning. And you had this big population of miners, wealthy mining kind of families, and also, poor local miners who were unfortunately kind of relatively controlled, in some ways kind of enslaved to the area. And so what that did was create a quick demand for alcohol. And so originally the wines were being brought by Peru, transported over the Andes, but that's not an easy journey to make, especially in those days. And so then the wine production really started in Bolivia in order to produce wine for the Potosí mines. And so you can see where Potosí is on the map, and you can see that first region in blue, which is Sinti. And that was the most historic region to develop because it was the closest to Potosí. At Potosí, we're at incredibly difficult, challenging altitudes. It's really hard to breathe, let alone produce wine. And so there were some vines there. There still are some vines there, but it's minute in terms of production. It was as you move kind of to lower, more amenable altitudes in Sinti and also Tarija that the kind of wine industries really started there. And they also started making their own brandy. So Singani is the Bolivian kind of version of Pisco, and it is only made from Moscatel de Alejandría. And that was obviously a much easier way to kind of store alcohol, to transport alcohol, and it would sometimes get kind of watered down, but otherwise drunk as the very kind of hard spirit that it is to enable people to survive what were quite difficult times in the 16th, 17th century. But today we have 4,600 hectares and we have 3 main wine regions in Bolivia. So the Sinti, as I mentioned, the little blue patch, was the original one, and that was because it was this beautiful valley and quite a protected area where you had water running through and lovely kind of red soils, which were quite, advantageous for winemaking. There you get these incredible old vines, mainly of these Criollo varieties, a lot of Moscatel y Alejandría. And one of the things that I find most kind of interesting and beautiful about it is that they use the traditional Jesuit method of growing the vines around trees, using them as tutores or tutors in order to train the vines. Most vines in the world are trained either by poles, by sticks, by wires. In Galicia in Spain, they use big granite poles, but a really easy way to kind of do it historically was to train them around trees. And so you still get these lovely old vines in Bolivia that are trained around trees. And those trees give not only support, physical support for the vine, but because they're often trees of different plants, you get different aromas imparted on the wine. So one of the most notable is this molle, this pink peppercorn. And it does give this really lovely nuance to the wines, especially those dry white Muscat wines that kind of take on this lovely pink pepper kind of notes. It's actually really delicious and quite appetizing. So that's mainly Sinti. And then we also have some weird and wonderful native varieties there, like Bistroqueña. And then we come down to Tarija, which is the kind of pink spot below. And that is really where we've seen a kind of development of new vineyards. This is just above Argentina. It's quite similar to the climates, the region of northern Argentina. It's a flatter landscape. It's easier to plant and cultivate. And here we've really seen the modern Bolivian wine boom. And that's with a lot of kind of international varieties. So a lot of Tannat, Malbec, Syrah, things that do really well at altitude and have that slightly thicker skin. So they're kind of protected from the quite intense sunshine we get at these higher altitudes. And then we have the Santa Cruz valleys, just outside of the capital of Santa Cruz. And that's a really interesting area as well, because they're all planted at altitude. But we do have this kind of interesting microclimate that comes from the huge kind of forests, which are kind of the beginning of the Amazon in many ways, around them. So slightly kind of more humid, but really makes very fragrant wines. Quite small production there, but wild. Like some of the wines you can taste, and this does come into the US, is Vinos 1750. And they're really interesting wines to taste because they have a Cabernet Sauvignon, for example, that just smells like oranges and and spices. It's absolutely wild. It's unlike any Cabernet Sauvignon that you'll ever taste elsewhere, and it's consistent every year. It smells like oranges and kind of wild herbs. So it definitely has its own kind of unique terroir expression. So Bolivia is one to kind of keep an eye on, but it's definitely a harder one to kind of access as well. But I know that Vinos 1750 does make it. Before we move on to Argentina, does anyone have any kind of questions, or is anyone curious about Bolivia?
Amanda Nicole Habif wrote in to say, even while flatter, is Tarija's altitude similarly high to the other northern Archi regions, or Archi regions? I might be saying that wrong.
Archi. Yeah, absolutely. So it's very similar, kind of the starting altitude. Tarija's I'll quickly flick exactly to the book and make sure that I don't misquote. Tarija's not as high as altitude as most of the kind of northern Argentinian regions, because most people have kind of opted to plant on the slightly lower land of Tarija because it's a bit easier. But it has that huge kind of influence of altitude, which gives you the incredibly cool nights, the really kind of hot sunny days, great acidity, and really intense color. Like it's quite like the wines of Bolivia, especially Tarija, are real kind of blockbuster wines. You know, it's very kind of big alcohol, big acid, big color, big concentration. And, you know, it's very easy to make concentrated blockbuster wines. So we start at 1,600 meters in Tarija, and they do have some vineyards that go up to over 2,000 meters. But the large majority of those are in the kind of 16 to 1,800 meter altitude band. And yeah, a really fun place to visit because it is the wine capital of Bolivia. And so you have like this in the city outside of the kind of wine regions, the Tarija city, they have this huge like disco ball wine glass, which is silver and colored and really kind of fascinating to see. Okay, any other questions about Bolivia?
Tony has one, which are there any varietals considered to be national grapes or styles, or is this just being explored?
I think a lot of producers would argue that Tanat is one of their kind of key grape varieties in Tarija. It is a variety that, you know, produces quite distinctive wines there. They also do a lot of Malbec, which they would also say is quite kind of their own identity. But for me, the kind of most important one in Bolivia is Moscatel de Alejandría. That's the most planted because it is used for their Singani. And I think that, you know, I don't think you find any expression of Moscatel like you do in Bolivia. So for me, that's the kind of champion. But they have quite diverse plantings. It isn't as if they have just, apart from Moscatel de Alejandría, they don't have kind of one main champion grape. They've kind of picked their own champions, each producer.
Thank you. Shay is wondering if it snows there.
It certainly does, yeah. It does snow all over altitude, but you don't get kind of quite deep snow. It's kind of peppering of snow. So there's never any problem of winter freeze or anything like that because we're at that higher latitude. So we're getting closer to the equator. And so we don't get the same kind of deep, heavy snows that you get further south. But you do get some winter snow, but it's more like a sprinkling a couple of days a year. So nothing that kind of inhibits the production of vines.
And then Joanne has a comment where she says, it's great to see the development in Peru and Uruguay. When she was there in 2007, there was no wine culture and all the wines were from other South American countries. So thank you very much for this review, she says.
Oh, super. There is a definitely growing wine culture. That's what I think is really interesting about, you know, in my experience in the last kind of 13 years based here, and visiting kind of Peru, Bolivia, Uruguay, all the different regions quite regularly, is just seeing this kind of wine culture really grow, and it is really exciting. And in Bolivia, it's quite kind of limited, but there's like sommelier groups now and sommelier schools and courses. And so that's really kind of accelerating the interest in wine. And I'd say the wine culture in Peru is largely due to that incredible growth of the gastronomy scene. And kind of wine going hand in hand with great food. Okay, so we'll move on to Argentina. Please excuse me, someone's knocking on the door at the co-working space and I don't think they'll stop. Give me 1 second.
Gracias, un segundo.
Okay. So Argentina, one of the great titans of South American wine. So as you can see, I don't know if you can see the map, maybe you can just kind of hide me for a second, but you'll see that the large majority of all of the wine regions are along this kind of corridor of the Andes. And the Andes Mountains are really fundamental for the production of wine in Argentina because they act in several different ways. First of all, they are a great kind of rain shadow. So we get this dry, arid climate, which makes it very easy to grow grapes and produce them in a very kind of healthy climate, which is very dry, doesn't have the kind of risk of any humidity or rot. But then also it gives us this access to water. So we don't have much rain. We have very limited rain in all of these regions. It's kind of less than 200 millimeters a year. But we do have access to the incredible kind of river waters coming down from the mountains, this very pure Andean snowmelt. And that's what meant that in the 1500s, they could plant quite successfully. So there were these irrigation channels that were made by the Huarpes, the kind of native community, and they were used by the Spanish to kind of redirect for growing vines in the 1500s. So Argentina grew relatively quickly as a wine production region, is now the 5th in the world. I think this vintage actually just come down to like 6th or so. But it is one of the kind of key producers in the wine world all over, due to its kind of volume, but also I think notably due to its quality as well. And we have wine regions today spread all over Argentina. So from the very kind of northernmost province of Jujuy, and then kind of getting further and further down into Patagonia, which we'll start to talk about a bit later. But if we start right at the north of the country, this is where we get the beautiful kind of Calchaquí valleys, which is where we have Cafayate. It's probably the best known wine region there. It's in Salta. And this is like a really beautiful high altitude mountain chain. And so this is where we get those very famous kind of Torrontés wines, also Malbec, and really expressive wines from this area. Very distinctive, again, because we have that really high altitude. We've got that intensity of color, intensity of flavor, high acid, and also quite some tannin. And here, these are really old wine regions as well. So these were originally planted in the 1500s, 1600s. We actually have Argentina's oldest continuous running winery there, Colomé, that has been making wine since the 1800s. But we also have lots of new plantings happening in more extreme areas, like in Jujuy. We've got some kind of very high altitude, over 2,000 meter vineyards being planted, and kind of, you know, pushing the boundaries there. But this is incredibly remote, so it never developed to the same kind of speed that we see further down south, because you are kind of confined by having to travel by mountain roads, and again, kind of try and bring equipment up. And if you're trying to sell your wine, you need to be taking it down. So it was very kind of like Bolivia, isolated in that sense. And so it's had quite a slow growth. And it's only since the kind of 2000s that we're really seeing this big boom again. And that's because of the accessibility has improved. And, you know, everyone's kind of looking for quality production. And here you get some wines of really good quality. But it will never be an area of massive quantity, because it is that much more challenging and expensive to make wines there. But I really recommend, if you haven't already, sitting down and doing a lovely kind of Malbec tasting, comparing a Malbec from Cafayate with a Malbec from Mendoza. And I think you really can like get that very clear insight into what this altitude gives you. So the main wine regions of Argentina is the Cuyo region, which is our central Argentina. And that includes La Rioja, San Juan just below it, and then Mendoza. And 90% of Argentina's wine are produced here. And actually, I think over 70% is produced in Mendoza. So we really are in the heartland of Argentine wine. And this is where historically it really kind of grew. There's several reasons why Mendoza and the Cuyo region became so important. Because we're at the foothill of the Andes, as I said, and we've got lovely kind of quite flat terrain. I don't know if anyone's been to Mendoza, but it is a beautiful place. That's why I choose to live here. It's a beautiful place to live, but you're constantly kind of at the floor of the mountains and then looking up at the Andes. So it is wonderfully easy to walk around and cycle because you're on a flat, and then you've got the kind of Andes up ahead. And so that makes it really kind of easy to grow grapes as well. And most of the kind of wine regions really kind of were developed on the flatter lands. It's only in the 90s that we start to see the advent of drip irrigation coming here. And that's when we start to see more development happening in the foothills and a bit more in the hills and the slopes, because you obviously cannot irrigate with flood irrigation, which is the main irrigation technique on anything that has hills and slopes. San Juan and La Rioja are lesser known, but they are really kind of part of the key domestic production for wines that are consumed here within Argentina. They're largely kind of more cooperative style wineries. La Rioja has one of the largest cooperatives in the world, in fact, and just make really kind of nice, soft, slightly kind of jammy, kind of warmer climate wines. But also we get some interesting kind of wines being made at higher altitude here as well, which have a bit more kind of definition and acidity to drive them. Malbec is the main variety, but also some interesting kind of torrontés in San Juan and La Rioja, and also a key area for Syrah and Bonarda. We're going to look at a little bit more detail in Mendoza. And I'm pleased that I got it close. 70% of Argentina's vineyards are in Mendoza. And what I think is really interesting is most people are very aware of perhaps Luján, the Cuyo, the Yucca Valley, Maipo. Those are the kind of central wine regions around Mendoza city, and where the kind of quality really developed from the 1990s. But it's actually in eastern and northern Mendoza where we have the real kind of workhorse of Argentine wine and a very large production there. So that's kind of where historically it all grew. And there was a very pivotal moment in which a train line was developed between Mendoza and Buenos Aires in the 1800s, 1900s. And that kind of gave a direct access to the market. And that's when we see in the 1900s, the wines of Argentina kind of explode in terms of production numbers, because all of a sudden they could load up their wines in barrels, put it on the train and shoot it across the country. And there's some lovely stories, in fact, if you speak to some of the kind of older generation here in Mendoza, when they still remember the train. It's now defunct, but they still remember the train, and they were working in these large wineries at the time that all had their own cooperages. They were big, you had tanks the size of football fields, quite literally. They were very big production in the heydays of Argentine wine in like the 70s and 60s. And there were these long pipelines that would connect the winery to the train station, and they would pipe the wine. And so what people used to do would tap into the pipe and steal wine. And so many of these winery owners got so frustrated with their pipes being broken on a regular basis so that people could thieve wine, that they just inserted little taps along different points of the pipe so that people could just freely take wine without breaking the pipes. So that gives you kind of an idea of the volume of production that Argentina had in its kind of real heyday period. And then since the 90s, we've really seen more of a focus on quality. People are drinking a lot less than they used to. And, at one stage, Argentina's wine consumption was 90 litres per capita. Today, I think it's around 23. But we've really seen this kind of shift from quantity to quality. And that's where we've seen this development much closer to the mountains. So you can just about see the kind of contours of the mountains on this map, but that's where the foothills really start. And so we saw gradually, the movement of Mendoza kind of going from the east and the flatter lands, the fertile lands, to starting to plant up towards the hillsides and getting those poorer, rockier soils, higher altitude, and kind of lower quantity, but higher kind of quality of wine. Amanda, so the tendency, yes.
Sorry, can I ask you a question that came in? So we know that Mendoza is particularly at risk of climate change really affecting grape growing there. Have you noticed anything in the time that you have lived there? Have you talked to growers, and what are people doing about the scarcity of water?
It's a key issue for both Chile and Argentina. And one of the main things that people have done very significantly in Argentina over the last few years is switch from flood irrigation to drip irrigation. That you cannot get more rain. So you just have to use the water that you have more sustainably. And that's been the main focus. And one of the key things that the agriculture industry can do is switch from flood where literally you would have these channels through the vineyard. There's this whole system of acequias, which is our irrigation channels around Mendoza. You see them on the streets, they're on the side of the road. And what used to happen is that there would be a tomero, which is the person that controls the water system and lifts up the kind of doors that allows the water channels to go to this farm on this day and this farm on another day. And so that was, the way that it was done until the 90s. And since then, there's been a big shift from just people running water, flooding their vineyard, to actually, using an allocated amount of water and providing drip irrigation. That's been one of the fundamentals. And then there really needs to be a focus on a more sustainable, bigger management of water for the city as well and the population. But that, with the current economic crises that are going on in Argentina and never seem to stop, it hasn't been a focus, but that should be the focus, because a lot of the water is just lost through leaks and inefficient water use. But we're also seeing, and this is part of this tendency that I have in this slide, we are also seeing vineyards developing higher in the mountains, because higher in the mountains, you get higher rainfall. So whereas here in Mendoza City, we get less than 200, or depending on the year, around 200 millimeters a year, in some of the very high altitude regions, like in San Pablo, which is in the Yucca Valley, you get up to 600 millimeters a year. And so that makes a huge difference on your requirements for irrigation water. So there's been a lot of development moving further into the mountains to get more kind of, rain and better access to that water as well. But I do think we will see, not necessarily only because of climate change, but we will see a reduction in the vineyards of Mendoza and Argentina, because there just isn't that demand for wine anymore, and it's becoming more expensive because of the lack of water. So I think we will naturally see a little bit of a shrink happen and a focus more on those higher quality production areas.
Super, thanks.
So these tendencies of these new mountain vineyards, I think, is very exciting and a key one to kind of watch out for, because whereas before it was all, in the easier kind of lower lands, now there's a lot of people planting, really going to quite extremes to plant into the mountains. And we've seen some development within the foothills as well, which is very different to the ones that are on the foothills. So this larger picture that I have here is actually a mountain vineyard in Uspallata, which is on the road to Chile. And it's really exciting because we have totally different soils, and a really different climate, very different kind of face to the wines of Argentina. So always creeping higher in Mendoza, but also really exploring deeper. There's been a huge focus on understanding the regions from the kind of soil profile and focusing on exactly those micro terroirs that you have and how that expresses in the wines. So it used to be the case when I first came to Mendoza that people, wineries and winemakers would always take me to the barrel room and would, stroke feel the kind of finesse of the barrels and talk about toasting and all the rest. And then it completely shifted to actually the focus being fully on the vineyards and like going out there, tasting the wine in the vineyards, tasting the wine in soil pits, and really kind of understanding the wine from the vineyard rather than through the winery. And so I think this is a really key focus throughout South America, but specifically in Argentina. And we have this whole new system of GIs, which is geographical indications, which are appellations. And those are our new kind of appellation systems that are these kind of like striped lines in the map. If you can see, there's the political boundaries, which are the block of colors, and then these new GIs, which are the striped lines. And those new appellation system is based on geology, climate, and finding some kind of identity within that. So in order to get one of those approved, they have to come to the university and also the INB, which is the viticulture board, and prove that this region is different to the neighboring region for all of these kind of terroir qualities, which results in the wine. So I think that's a really interesting development. And I would really recommend, when you do your big Malbec tasting, that you taste through some of these different sub-regions, because I think we're really starting to see this great identity of Argentina's different terroirs through Malbec. So in the same way, when you're tasting your Nebbiolo from Italy, you don't talk so much about Nebbiolo, you talk about Barolo, Barbaresco. You know, I hope that we're going to start talking more about Guaiteieri versus Altamira, and kind of focusing more on those regional expressions.
I think piggybacking off of that, we have a number of questions that just rolled in. So from a marketing standpoint, this is from Lynn Farmer. In the past, Argentina's been content to market their wines as being from Mendoza without giving any regional nuance and sense of the diversity of the terroirs that you're addressing. So do you see a push among producers to draw greater distinctions and highlight La Consulta, Valle de Uco, Luján, etc., in their marketing plans and in their branding?
So there's multiple reasons why someone might just put Mendoza on the label. And in some cases, that's because it would be a blend of regions. So there are some producers, when they do put Mendoza on the label, it's because they're not particularly focused on the region. Maybe because they're blending, or maybe because it's coming more from Eastern Mendoza or Northern Mendoza, and they don't need to or want to highlight the region. I do think many producers are focusing on their single vineyards and single region wines, especially when you get to the very high premium level. And I think it is an increasing focus, but I think there's also an awareness that most, everyone in this Zoom room is, a wine connoisseur, a wine lover, sophisticated wine drinker. The majority of wine drinkers in the world, Malbec is a concept, and Mendoza is a simple concept. And if you've got far enough to understand where Mendoza is and how that kind of might reflect in the wine, then that's, a big deal. So I think kind of more simply, there hasn't been that focus for mass wines and that kind of more mass consumer. But in the premium end, there definitely is a focus, and especially I hope that we see it come through more in education as well, because, I think everyone's capable of learning those differences and enjoying those differences. So I think it's increasing.
I think that's great. It'll be great when we start to see it in the stores too, for sure.
Yeah.
Tony has a question. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just there. There are some producers that really do kind of focus on those single vineyards. Catena is a very big producer that you'll easily find, and they have their appellation range, which I think is quite accessible, where it's Malbec from different appellations. So I do think in the premium end, I think we're already starting to see it, but it's probably a bit more of a having to seek it out rather than have it kind of there explained in the store. I
agree. Even in Massachusetts, which I think is a more challenging wine market, we are starting to see a lot. Certainly Catena is one of them, of single vineyards from Argentina. Tony has a question, which is, in regards to sustainability, are there any major trends in Mendoza, whether through resource usage, labor, agriculture, etc.? For context, he keeps sourcing producers that tout sustainability, but aren't quite definitive on how or what they're doing to adhere to those principles. So in addition, do you have any recommendations for good certifying bodies that would carry merit there?
So there is definitely a growing focus on organic and biodynamic wine. It's a challenge. I think the thing is, with certifying bodies, they can be quite expensive, and Argentina is definitely, economically sensitive, and perhaps producers won't certify unless they are required to by marketplaces. But we are seeing, to be honest, it's cheaper to farm organically than to buy chemical products for your vineyard. And in Mendoza, we have a climate naturally where you don't really require spraying very often in the vineyards. It's very dry, it's very arid. Most of that production is organic. So even if you're not certified, most producers, the majority of them really aren't spending that much money on chemicals because they don't want to spend the money and it's not required. But they aren't certifying either because it's expensive. And you have to kind of get recertified. And then there's the whole issue of bribery, which is a whole different conversation but a very relevant one here, which does unfortunately happen. There are some different sustainability initiatives, but I think, there isn't anything on a kind of national level that has really kind of taken a big focus on sustainable initiatives. I'd say it's more focused on individual wineries, and they'll probably make most of those initiatives quite clear on their marketing and their website. There's, the kind of use of water is a really key point here, as kind of quite rightly mentioned. There are some fair trade wineries as well who are focused more on the kind of welfare of their workers and fair prices. So there's definitely initiatives kind of underway. But I think until there's a demand from the marketplace, they won't be certifying with those kind of big certifications, but just purely based on price.
Thanks. To jump back to a question about climate and weather challenges, Joanne is wondering, is hail still a major issue there?
Yes, it is. And you get hailstorms where the hailstones are bigger than golf balls. I mean, I've seen cars, one of my family friends here, their car was absolutely destroyed. Like, couldn't even be repaired from a hailstorm. They are massive hailstones. And so even though most producers that are producing grapes of a certain price point will have hail nets, because hail nets are very expensive, it can be up to $10,000 a hectare. And so you'll only protect the grapes that the grape value is worth enough to warrant putting in the hail nets. But even most producers that do have those hail nets for their high quality grapes, if you have a really heavy hailstorm, it doesn't matter. It's going to bring down the hail nets as well. But the hail is very localized. So it could be that, this little patch of your vineyard gets hit and then the next part, 5 meters away does not. So it is really unfortunate, and you're very unlucky when you get hit really hard by hail, and it is a significant issue. The other thing that you have here, which is kind of interesting, is when there's hail forecast, and if you're in the middle of the Uco Valley, for example, you start hearing these guns going off. And they have this, in Mendoza, they have a national system or a regional system where they try and cloud seed to try and break up the clouds before the kind of hail comes closer to the city. So there are lots of prevention methods, but whether any of them are really enough when you you can't stop nature. But producers here are very resilient to it and very kind of, they've lived with this their whole life. I think it's more in Europe, where it's kind of a new weather phenomenon, where they're kind of in shock and aren't quite used to the probabilities. Here everyone kind of factors it in as like a risk probability, and it's heartbreaking, but it's part of the terroir, it's part of the climate.
Super, thank you.
Okay, let's move further south. So we're going to go down to kind of Rio Negro, which is the most traditional southern wine region of Argentina. It grew quite significantly historically, but it lost out to Mendoza because the train line came about 10 years later. So Mendoza had this huge kind of like economic boost because they managed to get that train line sorted first. And then Rio Negro sadly kind of lost its space in the market as one of the key producers, and is still dwindling. However, it is a really beautiful region for wine growing because it has slightly more mild temperatures. We're not at high altitude here, but we have kind of milder temperatures, which give you some really nice kind of savory nuance to the wines. They're a bit more delicate, a nice area for Pinot Noir, and we have some really beautiful old vines in Rio Negro as well. An area that I really recommend looking out for the Pinot Noirs, for the Malbecs as well, for the Riesling, and some of those kind of more interesting, slightly cooler climate varieties that do really well. And then right next door is Neuquén, which was developed in the 90s and is a new region and slightly kind of warmer, and the vineyards are all facing the sunshine. So equator facing vineyards that give you greater ripeness. So a much kind of richer style than what you find in Rio Negro, which are all kind of right close to the river and have that kind of cooler microclimate. But what's really exciting at the moment in Argentina is this big kind of developed, small but important in terms of the quality development happening further south. So really in the cool climates of Patagonia, where you do have like issues of frost and snow and ice, but giving us a totally different style of Argentine wine. So really racy, cool climate wines with piercing acidity, Chardonnay, Gewürztraminer, Pinot Noir as well, some lovely sparkling wines. And we have the southernmost vineyard in the world, which is Otronia, and that's the picture where you've got the snow. They get snow most years down there. And this is so extreme. I mean, it's further south than the wine regions of Central Otago, New Zealand, and it is the southernmost commercial vineyard in the world. I'm sure everyone has a vine hidden somewhere, but the southernmost winery in commercial production. And it is so extreme, not only for the cold temperatures, but also you have wind here that hurtles at over 1,000 kilometers an hour sometimes. And so, but worth it. The results have been worth it because they've been producing wines of such kind of interesting character. And I think the South is where we're really starting to see a new face to Argentine wine. But we're also seeing our first real coastal developments in Argentina. So just outside of Buenos Aires, but then also further south, this lovely vineyard is also in Chubut, and literally the waves, the sea kind of laps up to the vines and soaks the vines in water sometimes when the tide is high. And so we're having some really kind of interesting new developments, including kind of underwater cellars and all kinds of interesting things happening along the coast, which is just kind of showing the very experimental and innovative attitude of Argentina's winemakers. And I think we'll see a lot of kind of interesting developments there. And there's a lot of similarities when we come to talk about Uruguay with these more coastal regions with the wines of Uruguay. So before we move on to
we
Chile,
have another question about Neuquén, if that's okay. Adam Chase writes that how much is water an issue on Neuquén? He's heard that the lack of it could be a threat to commercial viticulture. So is that a real issue there?
Water is an issue everywhere, absolutely. And Neuquén is no different. Both Neuquén and Rio Negro rely on irrigation. So it is an issue. There's also a lot of mining in Neuquén. So mining is uses quite a lot of water. So that's the main kind of arguments happening at the moment is, can we, make sure that we've got enough water for the agriculture rather than using it on mining. So it is still a debate. I wouldn't say that I'm not aware of any vineyards that are being abandoned because of water access. There's certainly some that have been abandoned because they haven't been economically or commercially successful. But that I think is a different topic. But yeah, water is definitely an issue everywhere in Argentina.
Thank you.
Apart from further south, apart from Chubut and further into Patagonia. Okay, let's go over to Chile. So Chile are a very long, skinny country and incredibly diverse. I think Chile is one of the most beautiful countries to visit in the world. It is so extremely different from the kind of north, where we've got the incredible Atacama Desert, one of the driest in the world, a breathtaking landscape that feels very remote. And then we've got the Andes all the way down the spine of Chile, providing this amazing kind of natural frontier from Argentina and the rest of the continent. And then towards the coast, we've got our very cool Pacific coastline. I don't know if anyone's been to Chile and they've been in the sea, then they will know how cold the water is. It is freezing. It is beautiful, but it's not great for kind of sunbathing and swimming because it is very cold water. You can only do it on very hot days in the summer. And then all the way down the south, we've got, our route to kind of Antarctica and the very icy kind of end of the continent in Patagonia. And so all these natural frontiers created this kind of real paradise for viticulture, because that's why it was never impacted by phylloxera. It was very difficult. You know, it's very difficult to get to Chile anyway. I mean, it's much easier now that we have airplanes, but you know, for people settling there, it was not easy to get there. That's why they didn't have as much immigration. They didn't have that same influence that we had in Argentina and Brazil, because getting to Chile is not easy. The coastline is fierce, the mountains are high, the Atacama Desert is brutal, and then at the south we've got, you know, the icy kind of end of Chile with Patagonia. But it does make it a really interesting kind of Garden of Eden when we think about it in terms of wine, because we have such different microclimates throughout these different regions. And we not only need to think of Chile as north to south, but we really need to think of it climatically as east to west. From our coastal regions, our entre cordilleras, which is between the mountain ranges, and our Andes regions. And the reason the entre cordilleras is called between the mountain ranges is because we also have coastal mountains. So those coastal mountain lines between the Andes mountains and the coastal mountains gives us this really great kind of rain shadow in the middle and a really lovely kind of balmy, more Mediterranean dry climate. And we'll explore a little bit more here, but the coastal regions, which run the length of the country, the coastal wine regions, have always kind of been planted to some extent further south, in Colchagua and Etapa, for example. But the kind of big kind of change happened in the 1990s, or actually first in the 80s, I think it was 82, when Pablo Morandé planted first in Casablanca. And it was always considered far too cold. Like the Pacific coastline is freezing and they get this big fog in the mornings. It was considered kind of, you know, rubbish land for cultivation. It was only for sheep. And so it wasn't until Pablo Morandé kind of pioneered the region in the 80s and managed to convince one of the wealthiest men in Chile, one of the owners of Concha y Toro, to let him plant a vineyard there. And they did, but within the first year, they lost everything to frost. And so he needed to replant the following year, managed to convince this chap to give him more money, replanted. And after about 3 years, got the first vintage and showed this wine to all these winemakers in a wine club that they had blind. And they all guessed it was a Chardonnay from Burgundy. They couldn't imagine that Chile would actually be able to create Chardonnays of that kind of style. And that was really where we saw this kind of coastal development, this cool coastal development. And now we see it in very significantly in the regions of Casablanca and neighboring San Antonio, but also much further north in Limerick, in the Atacama deserts. We have some like incredible vines right on the coast there. And then also further south, we've got some beautiful vineyards. So on the left here, the one with the cactuses, that's in Limerick, which is one of my favorite coastal regions. Got this incredible limestone soils, so marine soils, very cool, great for Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Sauvignon Blanc as well. And then on the right, we have this beautiful kind of coastal vineyard in Maule, which is very far south. And this is actually the vineyard of Torres. And they wanted to plant, they were looking for schist soils. So Torres, the family, have vineyards in Priorat in Spain, and they were like, okay, we're going to look for our mini Priorat in Chile. And so they planted on this beautiful kind of schist hillside, which is, I think it's about 30 or 40 kilometers from the coast. So they thought they'd be kind of protected from the coastal influence. They planted Garnacha, they planted, you know, these kind of big, bold Mediterranean varieties, Cabernet Sauvignon. Within 3 years, they had to rip it all out because none of it would ripen at all. It is that cool. And so they've replanted it with Pinot Noir, and now they make a very delicious Pinot Noir from this amazing schist vineyard. But don't underestimate how cold the coast is of Chile, and that's what's giving us some really exciting, cool climate wines. There's also been an interesting development now looking into island viticulture. So Easter Island, a winemaker, Alvaro, he kind of discovered these old vines in one of the volcanoes of Easter Island and has made it his mission to bring back viticulture to the island. We've also got Aurelio Montes, who's down there in the picture. He started planting in the archipelago, I never know which way to pronounce that, of Chiloé, which is very far south. So this will be a very interesting kind of new development. He's planted Albarino, Chardonnay as well, and some of these cooler climates varieties. So there's a lot kind of happening along the coastline of Chile, and always kind of very interesting. Chile never stops kind of exploring its extreme climates. And that's the same to be said about going further into the Andes. So the kind of counterpart to Mendoza, if you like, is Maipo, literally the other side of the Andes. You can do an incredible journey across the Andes, which I've done by horseback from Mendoza to Santiago or Maipo. And so Maipo was one of the traditional kind of mountain wine regions just outside of the city of Santiago, using the beautiful melt water that you get from the Andes, but also those gravel river soils, which is so good for lovely red wines in particular. But we've also seen lots of kind of new explorations further into the Andes, looking again for those high altitude temperatures, the cooler temperatures, and really interesting soils. So this one on the left is Alcohuas, which is in Elqui. It's the highest altitude vineyard in Chile, apart from some in the Atacama, but they're very kind of small. But this is at over 2,200 meters altitude, and these incredible kind of granite soils. And then this one on the right is Eresti, which is in Cachapoal. No, it's not, it's in Curicó. And they're producing wines, this really hard to get to vineyards that they have to get the grapes, bring them down on one of those caterpillar, kind of buggies, because you can't get up there with a car. And there they've got very interesting kind of colluvial soils. So this is very much similar to what's happening in Argentina with that focus on soils and climate. It's really happening in Chile in the mountains as well. And then one of the things that I love most about Chilean wine and I'm most excited about is the reappreciation of these incredible old vines that Chile has such a huge host of. And that's kind of rediscovering these varieties like País, these Criollo varieties, which are really quite delicious and juicy wines and very enjoyable to drink, but also the weird and wonderful kind of old vines of Carignan, of Cinsault, of Semillon, of Chasselas. You've got so many different old vines in Chile that you can really kind of explore. And these old vines are not only interesting in terms of the quality of wines that they're producing and the character, but they're also a really good kind of sustainable way forward when we talk about climate change, because they are mainly in the Secano regions, which are the dry harvested regions that are unirrigated because they have enough rainfall, but they also have these very deep root systems, so they require less water. They're very kind of resistant to drought, and they're very resistant to more challenging warm temperatures. And Chile is kind of in this mega drought. It's called the super sequía. We've had it for 12 years running now. There was some decent snow this year, but it probably, Chile is even more so struggling with kind of water supplies. And so looking for more sustainable ways to farm and use water is one of the key areas to focus on, but then also moving further south. We've also seen, in the same way that we've seen this happen in Argentina, we've seen this great kind of push towards the south of Chile, looking for those cooler temperatures, that higher rainfall, also some very interesting kind of volcanic soils down there. And so we have some really beautiful wines coming from the region of Osorno, the kind of lakes and rivers region, and giving us, again, just this totally different face and more diversity to Chilean wine. There's one thing I did want to mention, which I think is very interesting. In terms of appellations, we don't have the same exploration that's happening with the GIs of Argentina, but we do have some interesting associations that are being made and appellations for kind of wine regions in some ways. So Vigno was really the first, which stands for Viñadores or Vignerons of Carignan. And this is an association where any winery can join, but they have to be making Carignan from old vines from Maule, aged for a minimum of 2 years, dry farmed, bush vines. And so it's a very kind of, interesting the way that Chile's winemakers are grouping themselves in different styles and productions. We've got the same happening with another association called Al Maule, which is all about País in Maule. We've got producers coming together in Itata for their Cinsault. So we're really starting to see some very interesting and diverse groups coming together in Chile to promote certain regions and also to promote certain varieties and styles of wine. Okay, we're at the end of Chile. So if anyone has any kind of questions or thoughts on Chile before we move on to Uruguay.
A couple questions came through. So one was sort of at the very beginning as you were leaving Argentina and going into Chile. So in the Patagonia and Atlantic regions, what do you see are the biggest pressures and risks to grape growing?
In the Patagonian regions, I mean, the pressures are the fact that it does rain a lot more. So the pressure is fungus. The pressure is having to deal with that. But it's by no means a difficult pressure, because you have most of Europe's wine regions have the same kind of disease pressure as you do there. You've got wonderful access to water. It is more expensive because you need to be planting on the hillsides in the south in order to kind of mitigate the frost risk. So you have to be planting on the hill, which is obviously a much more kind of labor intensive and expensive way to cultivate. And then there's also a kind of social economic issue where the south, has been kind of somewhat ignored over the kind of history of Chile and not given the same economic or social development. And so there are some kind of tensions between local communities there and businesses coming in. So you have to be very sensitive about development in the south and making sure that you're doing that with the approval and respect of the local community. And getting workers down there is really tough because no one's trained in viticulture in the south. So you're having to kind of convert farmers and teach them how to do viticulture. So it's not easy. And that's why I don't think we'll ever see big kind of plantations happening. But it is a very interesting development, and one that's certainly kind of, step by step, changing the kind of culture of the South and creating more opportunities as well.
That'll be interesting to see how that progresses.
Mm.
Lynn has a question. He says, would you also say something about your impressions of Movi, M-O-V-I?
Yeah.
Chilean wineries seem mostly to be very large or very small.
Yeah, I mean, there are three very, very big wineries in Chile, and Concha y Toro is one of the biggest wineries in the world. So Chile does have this quite kind of polarized size of production. But there's lots of medium-sized wineries as well, but they don't make as much noise as the small ones have more recently with Movi. So Movi was developed to represent small wineries because they felt that their voice was kind of getting lost in the kind of bigger associations. And we've seen so many splinter groups. We've seen so many associations being formed in recent years, like Sur Chileno, Casablanca Off. Like, there's just so many different associations now in Chile because a lot of them feel that they do not have the power to get that same, that same message, that same kind of volume of their voice heard as the big companies. And they kind of group together to try and pool their resources and spend that money on marketing or, press trips or trying to kind of get their wines in front of the right people. I mean, I personally think that having big players also creates opportunities for Chile. Like Chile's enormous sales that have happened in China. It's one of the most, I think they're second to France as the most important wine country imported into China. And that's largely due to Concha y Toro. So, there have been great kind of political, Chile managed to get a free trade agreement. There's been, some national incentives too, but really it's the power of a big company like Concha y Toro that opens that door and gives opportunities to other producers in Chile. So I think everyone loves to complain, but I think there is definitely a benefit of having big companies too that open doors for you. And then, consumers are savvy enough that they're like, okay, cool, I've tried this one. Now I want to try something smaller and more niche and interesting. So I do think they benefit from having big, powerful players as well. And working together is a great way to have a more communal voice.
Thank you. Okay, one more question before you move on. So Aga and James Hilferty are here. Hi, guys. Amanda, what do you think the future of labeling will be from Chile? Do you see producers choosing to use the labeling of Costa, Andes, and Entre Cordilleras? Will consumers finally embrace this, as they seem to be hesitant to accept this labeling? Or do you think something more specific will be used, like specific ABAs as they use in America?
It's a very interesting question. And when the kind of Costa Entre Cordilleras and Andes was created by Wines of Chile, it was the whole goal was that people would use it. No one, I don't know anyone really that does. So like, I don't think wineries have adopted it. I certainly don't think the market's adopted it. I do think it is very interesting and important in terms of kind of education and communication, because it gives you, it instantly kind of, it gives you that separation, because otherwise everyone naturally, I think as humans, we do that north to south rather than east to west. And east to west is so much more important climatically than north to south in Chile. So I do think it kind of opens the conversation more, but I haven't seen it adopted much on labels. And I think if we haven't adopted it, it's existed for over 10 years. If we haven't adopted it yet, I can't imagine it's going to be adopted anytime soon. But you do start to see producers, especially with Costa, you do start to see producers using that kind of coastal, meaning in their marketing and in their sales, and trying to make it very clear when it is a coastal region versus, one of the kind of other regions. We haven't seen as much with the Andes though. And Entre Cordilleras is kind of everything else. So Entre Cordilleras doesn't really have the same kind of strong identity as the wines of Andes, or the strong influence, let's say, of the wines of the Andes and the wines of the coast. And ABAs, they are kind of coming into play a little bit more. I think, we're starting to see that. We don't see it so much in the massive production wines, because they just use Central Valley, because they are blending from, enormous areas or diverse areas of Chile and blending it into one wine. But when we're seeing more niche wines and when we're seeing more premium wines, that kind of, that DO, they use DOs in Chile, those do kind of come into play a little bit more. And I think in regions like Itata and Maule, where you do have quite a kind of regional identity to the wines, I think those are becoming incredibly important. Regions like Colchagua, you have a huge range of climates, styles, varieties. So it's very hard to talk about the style of a wine from Colchagua. Whereas you can talk about the style of wines from Itata, you can talk about the style of wines from Limery. And it's not necessarily reflective of the size, but it's reflective of the kind of unity of the kind of climate and soil and producers in that region. I hope that answered the question.
Definitely. We are all set right now.
All right, let's go to Uruguay. And hopefully I can incentivize you to come to our tasting. Because I love Uruguay. It's one of my favorite countries in South America. It is small, but it is very particular and has a lot of personality. We start talking about Uruguayan wine since its independence, which I think is a mistake, because there were vines there before, but it was part of Argentina, it was part of Brazil, it kind of got thrown around a bit. And so it wasn't until it kind of became independent, I think it was 1825, that we start to kind of look at its winemaking history. But because Uruguay has this Atlantic climate, it is a more challenging region to grow vines compared to kind of Argentina and Chile. And so it was quite kind of slow to develop until we had more, viticultural knowledge in order to be able to grow grapes successfully in this slightly more humid climate. I always say it's better to compare Uruguay to Galicia or Bordeaux. It has a more similar rainfall. We've got over 1,000 millimeters a year. It has that Atlantic coastal influence, not that kind of cold Pacific influence that we have in Chile and Peru, but that kind of slightly warmer Atlantic influence that we do have in Europe as well. So it's totally different to the other wine regions and countries of South America. And you kind of need to break away from those when you start to kind of think of Uruguay and taste the wines. there's almost 6,000 hectares, so it is relatively small. And we have we have like over 100 different winemaking families. So they all have quite a unique identity. And I'd say that every wine in Uruguay tastes different. Not necessarily due to the climate, because that climate is shared by all of the country, but very much to do with the soils. We have over 99 different classified soil types in Uruguay, and the families, the culture. So each family producer makes their own wine in their own style, cultivates their vineyards how they have, been passed down from their grandparents and parents, and really planted the varieties that kind of speak to them. So they'll always have Tannat, but they will also pick the variety that they most kind of relate to, whether that's Sangiovese, Nebbiolo, or Zinfandel. They really pick the variety that kind of reflects their family story, and often a story of immigration. The real heartland of Uruguayan wine is Canelones and Montevideo, so just outside the capital city of Montevideo. I think that was largely due to the kind of convenience of being there with the main market. But you also have these lovely fertile kind of clay, calcareous soils, sloping hillsides. So those nice hillsides, they're very kind of, they're undulating hills. They're not extreme, but those hillsides give you good kind of water runoff, which is important when you have the high rainfall that you do have in Uruguay. Tannat very much became the champion of Uruguay because it performs so well. Tannat is interesting because you can make Tannat at high altitude in very dry climates like in Bolivia and Argentina. But you can also make beautiful Tannat. Tannat does really well in humid climates as well. It's got this thicker skin, so it's more resistant to the kind of the fungal diseases that are more prevalent in humid climates, and always gives you a wine of great kind of acidity, color, tension, and real kind of personality. So Tannat rose to be the star, but we also have Albarino, which is becoming a fast emerging star of Uruguay. And I think that's largely due to this explosion of production that's happened in the east of Uruguay. So our new kind of eastern frontier, and that's edging towards Brazil. And here, this was always considered, it's beautiful beach country, by the way. This is near Punta del Este. You've also got Punta de Lobos. You've got all the kind of amazing surf beaches or sunbathing beaches or glamorous beaches. This is where everyone kind of hangs out in the summer. But it was always considered very poor farming land. And there was one chap that actually planted here in the 1820s, I think, or maybe a bit later, I think it was 1890s. I'd have to check in the book, but he planted here. He was very excited. He bought like over 2,000 hectares of big estate, planted vineyards, and it just didn't work out. The soils were so rocky and so poor that unfortunately he lost a big fortune and kind of decided to turn it into a like holiday resort instead of the vineyards that he originally had envisaged. And so it wasn't until the 90s that we start to see producers kind of coming back and replanting what was considered farming land, and replanting, but making sure that they were kind of managing the soils, because we do have poor granite soils here. So in some cases you even need irrigation, which is nuts, because when you've got 1,000 millimeters of rain, to be adding irrigation just reflects how poor the soils are. But it gives you this really incredible energetic wines, great acidity, lovely tension, very kind of bright fruit expression, and that's in the Tannat as well as other varieties. And it's really proved the kind of new mecca for Albarino, which also, when you consider the climate's quite similar to Galicia, and we've got those granite soils very similar to Galicia, makes perfect sense that that's worked out. One thing I do recommend doing with Uruguay is, like doing your Malbec tour of Argentina, do a Tannat tour of Uruguay and taste the different regions by comparing where they each come from. And if you come to the tasting next month, the following month, it's in November, isn't it? Then you can really kind of start to taste these regional differences that you get in Tannat. And it's a really fun, great variety to do that, because it's a variety with lots of personality, but it reflects and shows quite nicely the different regions. Super. So we're going to move on to Brazil, unless anyone has any particular kind of questions or thoughts about Uruguay, but we would definitely be diving very deep with the winemakers at the tasting. So I hope that people will be able to join us in person.
No questions have come through.
Okay, so here we are in Brazil. So Brazil had this very interesting kind of history of wine, which started in the 1500s when the Portuguese came. And they started planting vines then. So I think the 1530s is when they first started planting vines. It took about 10 years or 20 years in order to actually get the first vintage in 1551, I believe. And they gave up. That was it. One vintage, made the history books, got it in, got it on the record that Brazil has this wine history from the 1500s, but completely abandoned it because it was too humid. It was very challenging in those times when you had quite a kind of simple viticulture. And so it wasn't until the 1800s that we really start to see Brazil's kind of wine history restart. And that's largely with this big immigration of Italians that came in that period. And they would arrive to the ports of Sao Paulo or further south, Porto Alegre, and they were given the opportunity to have land up in the hills where no one wanted to live because the hills were challenging. And so they were given land there, and they would go and they would cultivate their vineyards. And that's where we really start to kind of see the traditional wine regions of Brazil come about. Here we have the kind of cooler climate. We're at the south of Brazil. It's the coolest climate of Brazil, but we have quite high rainfall. So you have to use those hills in order to really be able to kind of grow vines successfully without too much rain. And the real kind of champions here are Merlot and Chardonnay. I'd say that's more for commercial reasons than necessarily being suited. But you also have that Italian influence. So they also produce a lot of Asti, sparkling Asti style wines. And Brazilians have a real sweet tooth. So those actually sell very well in Brazil. But the kind of quality revolution that we've really seen there since the 90s is in sparkling wine. And Brazil makes some really excellent traditional method sparkling wine, much more similar to kind of Cava in profile than Champagne because we're in a slightly warmer region, but really nice kind of long bottle aging, some really complex, delicious sparkling wines. And then we've got the kind of new frontiers of Brazil, and that's kind of moving to the Pampa region, so the region which is bordering Argentina, Uruguay. Well, it actually does border Argentina too, but anyway, mainly Uruguay. And so those are the kind of the beautiful kind of sweeping lands you can see actually in this picture here with the gaucho. These kind of more sweeping lands, much more similar to kind of Uruguay, Rivera in its climate. Then we also have a lot of developments happening at altitude. And this picture with snow in Brazil, yes, is at altitude in Santa Catarina. And so here we're really seeing kind of winemakers develop more, looking for those kind of cooler temperatures, those cooler climates. And then the very interesting thing that I'm a big fan of is the winter harvest, which is a whole new viticultural method in which they are harvesting in winter and pruning during the summer. And the reason they do that is because actually Brazil in the winter is one of the best times of year to visit. You've got sunny, bright days, lovely sunshine, lovely warmth, and then the evenings are cool and you don't have the rainy season. So it's a very interesting kind of innovation that they've been doing with this Colheita do Inverno, this winter harvest. And you see that a lot in the kind of mountain chains, especially Serra da Mantiqueira, which is where this map is from, and some lovely kind of intense Syrahs that, have like dark peppery notes and are quite kind of Rhone-like in their style. So lots kind of happening in Brazil, a big kind of sleeping giant, in my opinion, one that we'll see develop a lot. There's a big market for wine in Brazil, a lot of Brazilians drinking a lot of wine from South America. And so the wine industry is growing quite quickly, and with kind of modern innovations, making it more plausible to make wine in this slightly more challenging, humider climate. And that's it. We've come to the end. We've done our tour of South America, and I hope we haven't been too long, but we've done our big tour of South America. And if you have any extra questions, I'm here, and more than happy to talk about any of the regions that we've covered.
Feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question. Amanda has this slide up, her Uruguay masterclass with the fantastic winemakers who are coming into town is Wednesday, November 2nd. I just put the link up in the chat for anybody who's interested in coming to that. Tim, I know, is going to put the links up again to purchase Amanda's either ebook or hardcover book, along with the along with the discount codes, because this is truly a fantastic reference book. And I'm impressed, Amanda, that you were able to give us so much information on this an hour and a half that you were. Roz just asked about the winemakers who are coming to the class. I don't think we have the complete list yet. They're going to do a bit of a tour, right, of North America. I know that they'll be coming in from New York and doing a couple things here in the Boston area. We can get you that sooner, but we don't have, I would say, definite winemakers. Do you know of any, Amanda, who will definitely be joining us in Boston?
I'm not sure who would definitely, but Fabiano Braca will normally come. She's great. She's a winemaker in Atlantida, which is a really interesting wine region of Canelones, very kind of cool coastal. I'm sure we'll have the guys from Pisano, which are a great wine family. Nico will probably be joining us, and also from the amazing project of Gabriel Pisano, which is kind of one of the new generation, very young winemakers, some really interesting wines. I imagine Juan Andres Marichal will join us. We always, I love touring with Uruguay because Uruguayans are so much fun, and they're just such a great group. And actually, if Juan Andres comes, I'm pretty sure he'll bring his special Tanat vermouth, which is a great way to finish.
That sounds like so much fun. Well, I will certainly be there, and Amanda will certainly be there. She will be there with her books, which I bet we could twist her arm and she would sign for you. If you want to bring your own also, that would be great. Amanda, if you want to stop sharing your screen, if anybody just wants to pipe up and chat, feel free. Does anybody have any further questions? Okay. Thank you, Amanda, so much. This was really fantastic. We loved hearing from you and talking to you. I learned a lot, and I can't wait to delve into your book even more and to see you here in November for sure. Does anyone have...
tasting some wine with you?
Yeah, me too. Any final questions? We're going to put this up, this webinar up on our online classroom on our platform, and we're going to send everybody just a free link so that they can access it whenever they want, including you, Amanda. And thanks so much to you and to the Académie de Vin Library for making this happen, truly.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks. Take care, everyone. We'll see you next time.